of Smith Point, Virginia. The hazardous weather conditions are expected until 6 a.m. Tuesday. Impacts. Conditions will be hazardous to small craft. Inexperienced mariners, especially those operating smaller vessels, should avoid navigating in hazardous conditions. This is a statement from the National Weather Service. For the following county, District of Columbia, and the following counties in Maryland, Central and Southeast Montgomery, Charles and Prince George's, and the following counties in Virginia, Arlington Falls Church and Alexandria, Eastern Lothian, Fairfax and Prince William, Manassas and Manassas Park. Winter storm warning remains in effect until midnight tonight. Heavy mixed precipitation expected. I told him head back through Sunday night around 4 to 6 inches with ice accumulations of a light glaze. The areas affected include the Washington metropolitan area. The hazardous weather conditions are expected through midnight tonight.
I'm supposed to
The
believe
steadiest snow will fall through this afternoon before tapering off to an intermittent mix of light packs. Travel will be very difficult Sunday through Tuesday morning due to a prolonged period of snow and precipitation.
Fuck's sakes. 30 fucking
If you must travel, keep an extra flashlight, food, and water in your vehicle in case of an emergency.
So the
When
idea of doing
venturing
this without
outside,
any help
watch your
whatsoever
first few steps taken on steps, sidewalks, and driveways, which could be
supposed to believe that? Please,
risk
turn
of fall and injury.
the weather on and off and on and off.
This is a statement from the National Weather Service.
Just disappeared.
Counties in Virginia, Clark, Shenandoah, Warren, and Western Lothian, and the following counties in West Virginia, Berkeley, Eastern Grant, Harding, Jefferson, Morgan, Western, and the following counties in Maryland, Central and Eastern Allegheny, Extreme Western Allegheny, and Garrett. Winter storm warning remains in effect until 6 a.m. Tuesday.
The same thing again.
Heavy mixed precipitation expected. Total snow accumulations of 8 to 14 inches and ice accumulations of around 1/10 of an inch. The areas affected include portions of Shenandoah,
already, and then the next thing was the
Valley of Virginia, the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, and the Potomac and Allegheny Highlands of West Virginia. The hazardous weather conditions are expected through 6 a.m. Tuesday. The steadiest snow will this morning and afternoon.
I'm not even
Light snow will mix with sleet and freezing rain and become intermittent tonight into a
Jesus
Christ.
Yeah, I didn't mention what it was I wasn't going to bother with. Come on, get with it.
Travel will be very difficult Sunday through Tuesday morning due to a prolonged period of snow and wintry precipitate freezing.
For fuck's sakes.
If you must travel, vehicle in case of an emergency. When venturing outside, watch your first few steps taken on steps, sidewalks, and driveways, which could be icy and slippery, increasing your risk of a fall and injury. This is the New Weather Radio All Hazards Station WMG 736, broadcasting from the National Weather Service office in Sterling, Virginia.
I'm not even sure now. Yeah, okay, turn it off.
52.450 megahertz from an antenna located in Washington, D.C.
Holy fuck. Jesus fuck. And I'm supposed to go, gee, I don't get it. What's wrong? They're attacking me. They're coming at me.
You dumb better who, when, where, never. I let my dread hang, put 12 K from my teeth. If you're shorty fiending, then I might just have a bit. I'm the shopper's drug mart booming in the 6. How you get it out the mud? Community housing. North side of the rest places you weren't allowed it. Bitches used to laugh at the kid and I wanna see me. Told her put these on so you can see me coming in 3D. Forrest Gump to the money, you looking like Bueller. If it's not for everybody, I had to maneuver. We were shooting for the stars, I was that way they were shooting. I go Bob the Builder for the big stuff. If you acting funny,
It's built in love. It's another
certain
name.
men get crushed on road and keep it hush. A nigga wrote a statement on me, who can I trust? My mom's denying no woman shelter, it was just us. A man trying to comfort a kid, I told him head back. Before they start aiming at your head back, You get that? Backhand the back of your head until you head back. They wanna let they sick in the head, but then we get there. Trying to put a foreign on road and then we head there. Going down like Titanic is how I found where her head at. Keep a young mind with me, that will make you say, ooh. Or one to the west, bumping that day east. In my city, little nigga, I'm a don like you. She wanna be my playboy bunny, I guess I'm cute. I came from the Rex where they good with the text. That's the mess, got a text, now your wife giving sex. It's don't get close, it's don't get close, so we the gang. It's don't get close, you won't get smoked, you cannot hang. I'll shoot his neck, I'll shoot his chest, I'll shoot his bangs. It's don't get close, it's don't get close, so we the gang. Rolled up, be the hardest though, y'all butter sock. Block lights turning up, till the dogs locked it up. All of them we talk a lot, see them and they nodding back. Matching if I had a map, know what I would do to.
Why did you do a video in a grocery store?
I'll be bringing back the Holocaust. Hit them up, long distance, no calling. Loving when I pop it up, treat me like a movie star. Now she wanna love me cause I'm back from the metal bars. Cocaine white, like I'm walking around with cotton balls. Treated like an acrobat, flipping and I'm stretching down. Niggas talking like they cheat, all they do is rap beat. Talking all that shit up in on Snack DVD. Certain mans get crushed on road and keep it hush. Certain mans get crushed on road and keep it hush. You better who, when, where, never. Are you done? Yeah.
That's how fast it's supposed to be normally, not
Certain man got
8 to 16 seconds.
the general.
It's all solid state, there's nothing to
Dumb
do.
better who, when, where,
Wait to
never.
delay.
I let my dreads hang, put 12K from my teeth back. If you're shorty fiending, then I might just have to fix. I'm the shopper's drug mart booming in the 6. How you get it out the mud, community housing. North side of the Rex, places you weren't allowed in. Bitches used to laugh at the kid and I wanna see me. Told her put these on so you can see me coming in 3D. Forrest Gump into the money, you looking like Bueller. You figure it's not for everybody, I had to maneuver. We were shooting for the stars, I was that where they were shooting. I go Bob the Builder for the fix up if you acting funny.
Well, these are interesting books. It seems like before I even get to reading one page, I
Get
have
crushed
no
on
problem.
road and keep it hush. A nigga wrote a statement on me, who can I trust?
Sustainable
My mom's
design.
not in a women's shelter, it was just us.
2008 or so.
A man trying to
How to
comfort a
remodel
kid, I
buildings
told
to
him
the
head back
70s.
before they start
Not
aiming
buildings
at
to
your
the
head
70s,
back.
the book.
You get that? Backhand the back of your head until you head back. They wanna let they stick in the head, but then we head there. Trying to put a foreign on road and then we head there. Going down like Titanic is how I found where her head at. Keep a young mind with me, that will make you say, ooh. Or one to the west, bumping that day east. In my city, little nigga, I'm a don like you. She wanna be my playboy bunny, I guess I'm cute. I came from the Rex where they good with the text. SMS got a text, now your wife giving sex. Are you done? It's don't get close, it's don't get close, so we the gang. It's don't get close, you will get smoked, you cannot hang. I'll shoot his neck, I'll shoot his chest, I'll shoot his bangs. It's don't get close, it's don't get close, so we the gang. Rolled up, be the hardest though, y'all butter sock. Block party turning up, till the dogs locked it up. All of them we talk a lot, see them and they nodding back. Matching if I had a map, know what I would do to us. On the clock, I'll be bringing back the Holocaust. Hit them up, long distance, no calling. Loving when I pop it up, treat me like a movie star. Now she wanna love me cause I'm back from the metal bars. Cocaine white, like I'm walking around with cotton balls.
Welcome to Mignon Matters.
He's not an issue if the battle's full effect and the status members will get you. I'm back in action, slapping these raps who wanna act. As matter of fact, just slashing for slacking up on the set. Send them sentimental words like I'm a sensible cat. Sing a song and slice a bonus, it's a piece of my set. Set the traps cause I'm a savage, you the salmon I catch. 100 dead MCs in the thread of my net. The smell of death in my direction is starting to affect them. The fact of the matter is I'm a master, it's automatic. The idiomatic addict is at it cause I just had it with those who say the damage. I don't condone the domes who don't control and manage the flows to cause a panic, so step back. If your head is shaking, don't come back. I snap heads back till they crook up from right hooks, and right hooks are demons. Oh, I need you to leave shook. Ever see a person scalped in the daylight? Imagine how we act in the middle of the night. A bunch of savages running through your city like a pack of rabid dogs. I'ma unleash the pities, pissing on your property, marking our territory after it gets dark is when it starts to get gory. Murdering MCs, dreams on the beat, cause getting murdered on a microphone is worse to me. Spitting a high caliber, written's above average. My lyrics are like algebra, getting that mathematics. Putting the automatic pistol whip, I'm strong static. I ain't never taking a break at all, cause I ain't asthmatic. Always rolling up a pile of grass. You can ask Patrick, hope you got a baby with some hash in your past. Take a couple of dabs and I'm passionate, smashing it. Cross past no tap since the last visit.
Check this recital, guess I'm idle, never idle me. Don't let me carry stress or harbor rivalry. Been grinding full strength to be like to hear a burner beat. My destiny inspires me, continues to inspire me. My eyes and my mind remain open. It's like a black hole to the soul, and no, I'm not joking. It's real. I maintain and incorporate how I feel, where I'm from, why I'm ill, Castle Mountain, Castle Hill, in that whole area. It was the killer, man, my brother's on a barrier. It's getting scarier. I mean, it's scarier. It was on the barrier. Build it up, 47 feet up in the area. Hurt, cause I'm coming through in my data damager. Rude game, about to fuck you up a spoken word. It's dum-dums taking over in the common world. But here we are, gonna rise up and be the conquerors.
306 and the 604. Had to hit the YBR for that sushi raw. Ooh, let me tell them just who we are. Nowadays we got made to be movie stars. Doobie lit, bumping funk doobie is the Tahiti treat. Spilling on my Coochie fit. True MC, I don't care how cool you is. If you grip that mic, you better do that shit. Got the licks like damn, who that kid? That's when I take time to tell them who I is. It's the DR, no not from ER. Out in YYC.
That's not what I was attempting.
Warning remains in effect today and tonight for central and northern Maryland, including the Baltimore metro area. Days
For a while.
I did actually, yes.
Charles
I did a
Adler.
language here during my undergraduate degree where I
Still
worked in Montreal.
You're fucking
And I love your
province.
email when you said that you found out about snow in Montreal, and you also found
Oh, it
by
is.
the end of the winter, a bus stop suddenly started to appear from underneath the snow pile. It just reminded me of my growing up years in Montreal.
It was quite incredible. I thought I could handle snow reasonably well. I'm originally from a skiing area in Germany, but when after a couple of months of taking the same bus to work
We don't
every
handle
day,
things like
suddenly a bus
Germany
shelter
does, I'm
appeared,
sure.
I was rather flabbergasted.
They got the big Mercedes
Dr.
trucks
Shipman,
pushing
one of the
snowplows
most
out there. What they got? What they
significant logistical
got?
challenges for transporting vaccines, from manufacturer to distribution sites, given the storage temperature requirements and the different shelf life realities for example, Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. What are the most significant logistical challenges that are faced?
Well, this damn teenager,
Two
no,
key
man.
issues. We've got temperature requirements, obviously. Those vary between the different vaccines. So it varies between normal fridge temperatures, like every one of us has at home, and ultra cold temperatures. So we're talking
Okay,
here.
but it's not the exact temperature.
75
What's the, just the
degrees centigrade,
exactitude of the
which
temperature
is
keeping?
quite
What are we talking
normal.
about?
These are set out in the authorization documents for each vaccine, so they differ between the different vaccines.
So my one
But just
grandfather
for
maintained
comes a bit
medical
of
equipment in
headache, like
hospitals,
coordinate
and
all the
another
different
they made
temperatures that they
speedometers,
use.
instruments
The good
for
news is that
trains,
for the
and
last
my other
mile, so
grandfather
final
maintained
few
military
hours or
equipment
days, that can usually be done at higher
and
temperatures.
HVAC,
So not as every
refrigeration,
vaccination
AC, all
site
that,
across the
washers,
world that
dryers, all that.
have an ultra cold freezer, which
Why
would just
can
be
they not
unrealistic.
fucking
But that
explain
is something
this
to
to
keep in
me?
mind. The temperature requirements make logistics more difficult. Then there's also a shelf life issue. This also varies by vaccine and varies depending on the temperature they kept them. So
I
they're
could have
usually
spent the next 30
good
minutes
for
listening
longer. They
to
kept
the
at colder temperatures. And then if you defrost them, they have a relatively limited shelf life.
5 days or
Some
so.
reports of vaccines needing to be
They
used
take,
up
they
very
take,
quickly.
somebody took them out of the,
Seattle
it, so
over
they
the
said that
weekend,
it
where
could
they
last
quickly
5
had
days out of the
to
film.
raise
Maybe I'm
600
wrong.
people
That's
because
what
they were
I
about
said.
to run out of shelf life there.
I'm tired of that
We
shit.
need to transport fast enough to ensure that the maximum shelf life left at destination. So we don't want to dawdle around with the supply chain and then get to the final destination and pretty much use this month now. Other concerns have been security, for example. Storage locations in many countries have been kept secret just to avoid that there's any tampering or anybody stealing the vaccine as well. In supply chain terms, we call it the stock shrinkage, when things miraculously disappear. So there's been police escorts for vaccine deliveries, for example, to avoid anything happening to the vaccines. There's been some limited instances of tampering, but no big stories so far. Then, of course, there's the sheer magnitude of the logistics. I mean, usually we vaccinate a few people every day and kind of do it continuously, or there's targeted immunization campaigns where we focus on a particular town or school.
There's a clinic over here.
But you've got in certain populations.
The sign is out year-round saying, get your flu shot. Get your free flu shot.
Transport capacity. That
Signs out year-round.
The drivers, everybody handling the vaccine, people storing these. And most importantly, it needs good planning and coordination.
Well, we're oven mitts. I can touch this stuff with my bare hands. -70. I got a few seconds, right?
Dr. Sickley, please, would you speak as well to the need for proper infrastructure? This is a conversation that we're having in this country. We're waiting, of course, for the vaccines that we require. And there's a lot of debate about that in Canada. But the World Health Organization estimates, I found this quite amazing, actually, and disturbing. They're estimating up to 50% of vaccines are wasted globally due to inadequate logistics and infrastructure. And I imagine that could translate into billions of doses of vaccine lost worldwide. Now, I think we're speaking here in terms beyond COVID-19, but the impact would be significant, would it not, on COVID, or potentially on COVID-19 vaccines?
On everything. Everything is like that.
Absolutely. I mean, this sounds really shocking if you're thinking 50% of vaccines. How much do we need to produce to actually get everybody vaccinated? We have to consider that the 50% figure isn't overestimate. It does not refer to this pandemic. Usually we find that waste is lower in targeted vaccination campaigns. So if you imagine just everyday ordinary vaccination, so you give one person a vaccination, then you might have to throw away the rest of the multi-dose vial because there's nobody else who needs that particular vaccination on that day in that particular clinic. Then you have vaccination campaigns where you are vaccinating an entire population, an entire school, entire workplace, all at the same time. So it's much easier to plan. You're opening that vial and you know, okay, there's 10 people lined up here, we can actually use this entire material. So you can plan better according to shelf life. However, we have to say that vaccines will get wasted in the vaccination campaign. What we usually differentiate between is
apparently we're throwing away one dose with every vial.
And wrong temperatures, vials getting too hot or too cold, but just reaching its expiry date. And we have the other class of waste, which is the open waste. That would be handling errors, poor equipment being used, or simply not being having enough patients in one place. It's really important to avoid waste. And one way that we're doing this is through training people to administer it and also transport it correctly. So, for example, there was one case in Germany where people were given a full vial per person rather than that being split across multiple people with temperature-sensitive shipments not being handled with care. The training is really, really important. But then talk about the infrastructure, proper equipment. And that's not necessarily all within the supply chain, so it's not really about the storage spaces, the deep freezers and things like that. But one of the biggest things that we have right now is using the correct syringes to get these 6 doses out of the Pfizer vial rather than 5, if it's permitted in that particular country, of course. But that would just make up for a lot of doses. If you just get one more out of each individual vial, that's a lot of additional stuff. But also what we need is coming back to this good planning again. There's a lot of moving parts that need to fit together. And how much of those vaccines is going where and when and how does it get there? That's very often where we see this high wastage and where the 50% number that the WHO comes from. It's just, it doesn't all fit together. We get lost somewhere in between. The thing expires on the way or is not treated correctly.
Yeah, very concerning. And we've become more aware directly here in our conversation with you as to the sensitivity of the timelines involved. Now, we also look to the UK, and I've been talking about the rollout of the vaccine in the United Kingdom, England particularly, and what the numbers are and the expectations are.
Where is that? That was
February, and how that's going to work out for you now, given the EU's decision. But how is the UK addressing infrastructure, and how well is the distribution of the vaccines working out in England?
I mean, like you're saying, the key issue at the moment is the vaccine supply. How much are we getting? When are we getting it? Which vaccine are we getting? All that's very good for the supply chain, obviously. The UK is helped by the centralised system called the National Health Service, which is often criticised, but in this instance it's really simplified the coordinated approach of all these different areas working together. The logistics are a massive effort. We have armed forces supporting, we have a lot of volunteers working to just coordinate all of this and make sure that everything's right place, right time. Even supermarket chains have offered the refrigerated trucks to ensure that vaccine safely gets to where it needs to be deployed. The coordination is probably the most difficult part because there is a lot of uncertainty in the system at the moment. Uncertainty from the supply side, but also from the demand side. And that's where we see most of the effort at the moment to try and smooth this out, to get the uncertainty out of the system as much as possible. We need to acknowledge that this is a huge effort and it's still very new. We're still at the beginning of this vaccination campaign, and yes, there are issues. So far, the UK seems to be doing quite well with this, seems to be a well-coordinated approach, and it seems to be working quite well if we're looking at the numbers that we've got, how many people have already been vaccinated. But of course, we need to consider that the UK has made the decision to delay the second dose as well. The numbers for first dose are obviously higher than the would be if we were holding back the second dose.
All right, let me get you to hold on for just a moment, Dr. Schiffling. We'll come back with Dr. Sarah Schiffling. She's our guest from John Moores University in Liverpool in the UK, and her focus is vaccine supply chain, specifically the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, when it comes to vaccines from Europe,
studies are teaching. Hold on, that's a
AstraZeneca,
specialty
making their way to Canada eventually. There is another issue at play here, and that is international air travel and other transport of vaccines, because, as I understand it, the decrease in passenger flights internationally may in fact pose a problem as far as getting the vaccines transported across the Atlantic is concerned. Not sure if they'd get charter flights or what that situation is like, but we'll talk to Dr. Schiffling when we come back.
The airlines are now wine subscription
Living with joint pain and stiffness can be unbearable. Genical Pain Relief is a natural and lasting solution to reduce joint pain and inflammation in less than 5 days. That's right, 5 days.
Joint pain. I think the answer was the question.
It basically got a almost $3 billion injection of equity from two other hedge funds. The celebration on Wall Street Bets was pretty palpable. I mean, they had essentially, toppled this hedge fund. And, there's a sense that a lot of people have that Wall Street is basically a corrupt insider's game. And they're not entirely wrong about that. It's a game where big wigs are able to prosper even as everybody else doesn't. Obviously over the last 10 years, a lot of people have gotten rich in the stock market, and a lot of ordinary people have too. But that clearly is a dominant image of Wall Street, and it's not an incorrect one. And so what this has become for a lot of people, both people who are actually doing the trading and then also people observing it, is a kind of populist revolt. Wall Street is finally getting what it deserves. I actually do think there is a real resonance between what's happening in GameStop and other stocks like it and what happened in 2016 with, sort of the meme lords on places like 4chan and Reddit and the way they really try.
ZipRecruiter.ca/Canada. ZipRecruiter.ca/Canada. I'm seeing record sell-offs in the stock market, and I'm really worried about my investments. What should I do? Have you thought about owning gold? When markets go down?
I thought about it. I don't like gold that much. Platinum's like $1,000 an ounce too, so or a gram or whatever. Donald Trump's weird enough to ask the Ukraine to have information on his competitor or whatever. But the thing is, what information would the Ukraine possibly have on the guy that the U.S. that somebody in the U.S. wouldn't already have?
Talk leader.
Your cell phone company knows more. Your cell phone company knows more about you than the Ukrainian
over the wall at the Capitol building on January 6th, took some selfies and sent it to his girlfriend's brother, who just happens to be a federal agent, and the federal agent ratted him out. Let me talk about this. Would you turn a relative in?
The John Oakley Show, weekdays at 3 p.m. or anytime from Apple and Spotify podcasts. We are 640 Toronto.
Since the dawn of time, humans have been pursuing pursuing food. First in open plains and lush forests, and later in the crowded aisles of grocery stores. Today, that pursuit is over. With good food, you can get delicious, ready-to-cook meals.
Upper echelon are getting the most commercials.
Life world, and of course, the stock market, money in general, has always existed principally in our own heads.
You know, the stock market is kind of the perfect place for these kinds of of projects to sort of play themselves out. There's nothing imaginary about the businesses underlying the stocks, but stocks always have a certain kind of fantastical element to them. The continued ascent of Bitcoin, which is in a way a kind of perfect example of collective willing something into existence. I mean, you know, Bitcoin's value depends entirely on the fact that people think Bitcoin is valuable, and as a result, it really is that valuable. This group of people on this subreddit and other message boards kind of recognize that if they collectively decided to elevate GameStop.
And there are some really serious numbers that we need to talk about. And Preston Manning, the former leader of the Reform Party, the Manning Center, senior politician in this country, wrote an op-ed that he sent to the National Post, which they published, and the op-ed, or the open letter, is directed to the federal justice minister, and the headline, the title is, "Lockdown rules are violating our rights." I'm calling on the justice minister to intervene. Preston Manning will join us on this program later today. Back to Dr. Sarah Schiffling from John Moores University of Liverpool in the UK, and we're talking about the vaccine supply chain. Dr. Schiffling, when it comes to transporting vaccines from Europe, from the manufacturers to this country, which hopefully is going to happen sooner than later in the numbers that we want. Is there a problem potentially with air travel, given the decrease in passenger flights internationally? Because I understand that a lot of the vaccines, a lot of the product is actually transported on these planes.
Yes, absolutely. Vaccines are typically transported by road and air. They are high volume and fairly low volume and weight. So high value items that don't weigh much, don't have a lot of space, take up a lot of space. Lots of air freight is typically shipped in the bellies of passenger aircraft. So that does definitely cause an issue here. The international transport capacity needed to distribute the COVID vaccine has been estimated to be around 8,000 or even 15,000 flights. Production capacity so far is just not that high, so freight demand isn't either. We're not exactly short of empty aircraft that can be chartered if need be, but so far this does not appear to be a problem. However, as production capacity and therefore international shipments increase, we will have to see how the situation develops.
And one more question for you in the limited time that we have. Let me come back to the issue of vaccines degrading each time that they're moved. How does that play into the distribution equation? And how might it be addressed? Canada's a huge nation, as you know, having lived here, a huge nation in land mass with a relatively small but widely dispersed population of only 37 million.
That really depends on the vaccine again set out in the authorization document. It's mainly concerned for the mRNA vaccines, both Moderna or Pfizer-BioNTech. The UK authorization for the AstraZeneca vaccination, however, does not state a limit for the number of transitions, so the number of times it can be moved. Some vaccines are more stable than others here. That shows that the mix of vaccines is quite important for deployment worldwide. There's an issue, for example, for countries that have a lot of islands as well. So archipelago countries like Indonesia, for example, with limited air connectivity to some of the islands. If we're looking at the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine as just an example here, within the UK authorization document, what is stipulated here is that it can be moved up to 4 transitions if it's at ultra-low temperatures. We're talking about minus 70 degrees centigrade.
Minus 70, how is it a liquid? Is it a liquid? It can't be a liquid at minus 70.
At a higher temperature, 2 to 8 degrees centigrade, in 2 journeys, each up to 6 hours, or where there's a real deployment need, up to 12 hours in one sitting. So we have some wiggle room here for the distribution here, but of course it needs to be consideration of where do we go and how do we go there. So it comes back to air freight.
You're going to make a log of everything. These idiots don't know where it is being redirected.
So that's really important within our 6-hour window. or whatever it might be for
Does this
different
shit turn
vaccines.
toxic if
But
it
it
warms
also
up?
takes consideration of which vaccine
yes,
is
they're
best
like
for
mold
which
spores in it
particular
or
setting.
something.
You can't just say that one vaccine will cover everything. No, they won't, because we have different needs in different communities, in different locations here. It's a high transport effort for a country like Canada that is
You need
so
suntan
widely
lotion and I
distributed.
don't.
But I also ask you to consider that we have had really successful vaccine campaigns in places, for example, for the Ebola vaccine, which also has ultra cold requirements. And that was distributed in really remote regions of Africa that have very little infrastructure. And that was done successfully as well. So I wouldn't just deal with that. There's different vaccines for different needs. And also we do have good logistics.
How many minus 70 coolers are you aware of in your neighborhood? Because you're going to have to
I have
go
45 seconds, and I want to squeeze in one more question for you. Has there been anything at all that was unexpected that you had to deal with as far as the vaccine distribution in the UK is concerned?
An airplane, it's minus 40, minus 50.
Vaccine distribution, obviously, the current issue between the EU and the manufacturers is quite a big news affair here at the moment, of just going back and forth on who's going to get what. This is not unusual in global supply chains because we have companies that have different distribution hubs, different supply chains for different areas of the world. If you're looking at manufacturers of Nutella do the same sort of thing. They're looking at different areas of the world having different supply chains. But that can be really
Nutella is in a jar that don't need to be refrigerated. We're not talking about the same thing at all. That shit don't go bad.
It's been interesting to see that development. Of course, it's a really concerning thing. What fascinates me the most is the global impact of all of this and looking at how we need to really get away from the vaccine nationalism and looking at the wider impact this has on the world.
You would be so
There's
happy.
been a report published recently
You wouldn't care if it was 8 years old.
more than $9 trillion if governments fail to ensure developing economies have access to COVID-19 vaccines.
Right. Dr. Schiffling, thank you. I really appreciate you coming on and spending the time with us because it's fascinating to us.
The manufacturers of Nutella do the same thing. What a fucking reference. Who paid you to say that?
As far as the supply chains are concerned. Good talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Dr. Sarah Schiffling from John Moores University in Liverpool in the UK and the vaccine supply chain. We'll come back in just a minute on the Chorus Radio Network.
Here at Freshco, the savings just don't stop thanks to our big birthday bargains. So until Wednesday, fresh skinless chicken breasts are just $3 a pound. That's half off. Our birthday, your bargains. Freshco, lowering food prices. See flyer at Freshco.com for details.
Too, you cheap
At
pricks.
Toyota,
You took the skins
safety's
for
always
yourselves.
included. That's why our vehicle...
Bastards.
But it will happen, and they can't know precisely when.
You know, one of the reasons why it's hard to hold a stock when there's no clear fundamental reason to hold it is that, you know, you're by yourself and you're just kind of, you don't have any idea when it's going to drop. So the sensible thing to do is to sell it at 100. I mean, you know, you could argue the sensible thing to do would have been to sell it at 70, whatever. But I think one of the things that Wall Street Bets does is it actually provides a place where people talk to each other and encourage each other. And so if you go there, you'll see, you know, there are lots of posts saying, hold the line, you know, this is going to 1,000. And it does kind of play a role in sort of reinforcing that. But there is something mysterious about it. I mean, we don't entirely know, obviously, who's buying all this stock. I mean, a lot of the stock buying, I think, you know, has been done by shorts who are basically covering their shorts and trying to get out of their positions. And some of it is being done by Wall Street professionals who need to own the stock in order to sell options against them and stuff. But if you look at the volumes, I mean, an absolutely incredible number of GameStop shares is trading every day. So there are a lot of ordinary people in there buying and selling the shares. I think some of what's happened in the last couple of days is that there's a lot of day trading in the stock. So people are just trying to ride it up and down. But I think the main thing that's keeping it elevated where it is this Wall Street Bets conviction that there's still more pain that they can inflict on Wall Street. And that's the idea. But I just don't know. That's the fascinating question is like, at what point does that resolve vanish? It's an incredibly interesting story.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
James Sorowicki writes about business and finance. His article titled The GameStop Fiasco Proves We're in a Meme Stock Bubble is at marker.medium.org. And that's the The show on the media is produced by Alana Casanova Burgess, Michael Lollinger, Leah Fetter, John Hanrahan, Eloise Blondio, Rebecca Clark Callender, and with help from Alex Hainsworth. Zandra Ellen writes our newsletter. Our technical director is Jennifer Munson. Our engineers this week were Josh Hahn and Adrian Lilly. Katya Rogers is our executive producer. Bob Garfield will be back next week. And I'm Brooke Gladstone.
The Bhopal incident.
Stream KCRW's all-music channel, Eclectic 24, featuring the best of KCRW. It's a
found that the mental health index for working Canadians dipped to a record low in the month of December. We're going to talk about that with Paula Allen. She's Morneau Chappelle Global Leader and Senior Vice President for Research and Total Wellbeing. She'll join us later on the program today. And when we come back, our good friend, Dr. Eric Kam, Professor of Macroeconomics at Ryerson University. And what shape are we in economically in this country? Particularly, we may be looking at a spring election. Stay with us. It's the Roy Green Show on the Chorus Radio Network.
Well, the following tips from Vashon Insurance.
Who's got news? Who's got news?
From KCRW, this is Left, Right, and Center.
There is somewhat promising data on 2 new COVID vaccines that could expand the supply that's available later this winter. And already the Biden administration is committing to send more doses each week to states and using the Defense Production Act to speed production. How big a shift is this for the Trump administration? And is the Biden team moving fast enough? Welcome to Left, Right, and Center, your civilized yet provocative antidote to the self-contained opinion bubbles that dominate political debates. I'm Josh Barrow. On today's show, we'll look at Biden's raft of executive orders. How big a deal are they, and will they...
Connecting you with China and the world.
Now the news, I'm Su Yi. General Secretary of the Communist Party of China Central Committee Xi Jinping has sent a message to Nguyen Phu Trong, congratulating him on election as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam Central Committee. Xi Jinping says he's willing to work with Trong to strengthen communication, promote the traditional friendship, and deepen cooperation between China and Vietnam. Nguyen Phu Trong was re-elected as the General Secretary of the 13th Communist Party of Vietnam Central Committee on Sunday. Official data show the Purchasing Managers Index for China's manufacturing sector came in at 51.3 in January, edging down 0.6 percentage points from December. A reading above 50 indicates expansion, while a reading below reflects contraction. The PMI remained in expansion zone for the 11th consecutive month. The Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention says more than 24 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine have been administered in China. Preliminary tests show that the incidence of severe abnormal reactions caused by the COVID-19 vaccines currently used in China is no higher than that of the influenza vaccine. The Ministry of Science and Technology says 7 Chinese-made COVID-19 vaccines have entered phase 3 clinical trials. China now has 16 self-developed COVID-19 vaccines undergoing clinical trials. An inactivated vaccine received conditional market approval from the National Medical Products Administration last month. Israel has agreed to provide some 5,000 doses of COVID-19 vaccines to the Palestinian Authority. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz has authorized the delivery of the vaccines, which will be used for Palestinian medical workers. The move comes after United Nations officials and human rights groups urged Israel to provide vaccines to the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel has launched its own large-scale vaccination rollout following purchases of vaccines from drug companies Pfizer and Moderna. The Australian city of Perth was ordered into lockdown on Sunday after a security guard working in hotel quarantine tested positive for COVID-19. From Sunday evening until Friday, people in the city of 2 million must stay at home, except for essential work, healthcare, grocery shopping, or exercise, with visits to hospitals and nursing homes banned. Australia's 4th most populous city had recorded no cases of the virus for 10 months.
Oh, ban.
British Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove says the EU has recognized they made a mistake by briefly attempting to restrict some exports of COVID-19 vaccines by invoking an emergency Brexit clause. The EU reversed the plan to use the Article 16 clause to restrict exports of COVID-19 vaccines from crossing the Irish border into Britain within hours on Friday. Gove said he's spoken to European Commission Vice President Maros Sefcovic, and both agreed on the need to reset relations. Johns Hopkins University says the total number of COVID-19 cases in the United States has topped 26 million. The disease has killed over 438,000 people across the country. California reports the largest number of cases among the states, with nearly 3.3 million infections. The United States remains the nation worst hit by the pandemic, with the world's most cases and deaths. U.S. COVID-19 cases reached 20 million on January 1st, that have increased by 6 million within a month. China's star striker Wu Lei has been named into the best lineup of Asian football for the past 10 years, as selected by the International Federation of Football History and Statistics. Wu Lei is the only Chinese player on the 11-man roster. He's currently playing for the Spanish club Espanyol. Japan has the largest presence with 3 players in the team. Tottenham Hotspur forward Song Hui-min is the only South Korean player shortlisted. Detective Chinatown 3 has seen advance ticket sales exceed 100 million yuan, or about $15 million. The comedy film from Wanda Pictures led the advance sales chart for the week-long Spring Festival holiday, starting February 11th, contributing more than 2/3 of bookings. It will join 6 other domestic titles to screen in China on Spring Festival, the Chinese Lunar New Year, which falls on February the 12th this year. And that's the news.
Around Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. I'm Barbara Klein, NPR News.
Support for NPR.
Some kind of ex-cop?
Leave it the odds.
I'm the one you call.
International Federation of Football History and Statistics. Wu Lei is the only Chinese
of the people you'll meet. Chinese theater.
I'm Sean O'Shea from Global News, and I want to make things right. Email me, sos@globalnews.ca. That's sos@globalnews.ca.
At the advance sales chart for the week-long Spring Festival holiday, starting February 11th, contributing more than 2/3 of bookings. It will join 6 other domestic titles to screen in China on Spring Festival, the Chinese Lunar New Year, which falls on February the 12th this year. And that's the news. I'm Sui.
We do need to stand up and represent the people that are working in industries that are creating wealth in our communities, and the Prime Minister most certainly needs to stand up for our Canadian energy industry.
Which does what? Subsidize the Saudis.
Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe on this program last weekend. Hi, everybody. Roy Green Show, final day of January 2021. And later in the hour, you know, all of the initiatives that have been undertaken by various governments, including lockdowns and the like. Preston Manning wrote an op-ed, an open letter, which was published in the National Post. He's going to be joining us later in the hour. And the title of the letter is "Lockdown Rules Are Violating Our Rights." I'm calling on the Justice Minister to intervene. And Mr. Manning specifically points to the Charter and to the Constitution as examples of our rights being violated by politicians. And he doesn't disagree that there are emergencies and situations where, and the Constitution, or at least the Charter, allows for government intervention, but it's the manner in which he's done, and he provides some remedies. We'll talk to Preston Manning. It's been a while since I've spoken to Mr. Manning. Looking forward to having the conversation. Always look forward to the conversation with our guest now, Dr. Eric Kam, Professor of Macroeconomics at Ryerson University. And I always say, Dr. Kam, thank you very much for the time. I always say that what I really like about you is you don't have a political correct body and bone in your body. You just call it the way you see it, the way it is, right? Based on your knowledge and experience. So Thanks for doing that.
Oh, anytime. I have, as they say, I have no dog in this race. I don't represent shareholders. I don't represent any political party. And that's actually the fun of these appearances, is I know many people I hear on the media, and I like to listen to everybody, but let's face it, if you have an employer that is actively pursuing an agenda, then you better be, at least if not subservient, then respectful of your employer, or you're going to find yourself looking for a new employer. I work for a university, and while there are rules, they're a little bit like Groucho Marx's principles. If you don't like them, there's up.
Let me get to the first story with you, and this is the one that has really had the whole world talking over the last couple of weeks, and still today. The GameStop shares phenomenon. Would you share with us your sense of what's going on here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to tell the listeners that in true keeping with me and my history, I made no money off of this, and I tend to do very, very poorly when it comes to the stock market. So this GameStop idea, I mean, it's an episode in short-run fluctuations in the stock market, but what I like about it, what I was kind of hoping we could discuss, is it's combined with the macroeconomic variables that I don't think we speak about near enough, and namely that expectations, risk, and uncertainty. And all of these are very, very powerful in the market. So if you'll allow me, I mean, first of all, I think we should demystify the stock market, because I think some people think there's an allure, or if you'll excuse the term, a sexiness about it. But the truth is that stocks or shares of a company represent ownership or equity in a firm, which, depending on the type of stock, and we don't have to get into it, give shareholders some rights or some claims on earnings. But like any market, the stock market is just where buyers and sellers, or demanders and suppliers, come together to buy and sell their shares. And there was a time when that was done on a trading floor. Now that can be anywhere behind an electronic impulse, behind a keyboard. And then share prices, the part that I enjoy, are simply set by the most powerful factors that economics has, supply and demand, as buyers and sellers place orders and sell orders. So what happened this week? And I preface my comments again by saying I'm actually not an investor. Anything that I have in terms of wealth, I like to put into real estate, because as my grandfather always told me, you can't go wrong with real estate. So, but what happened this week essentially is something called shorting,
here
or short selling, and that's when an investor borrows shares and then immediately sells them. Or as my brother, who's an active investor, says, you sell something you don't own, and you hope then that you can scoop them up later at a lower price and return them to the lender and pocket the difference. Now that's effectively what happened. But shorting is based on short-term expectations of buyers and sellers and related fluctuations in the market. And that's a whole lot riskier than just buying stocks and taking what's called a long position. So to get to finally your question, a group of investors online realized the stocks were being bet against. They were being shorted, or people were betting the stock price would fall. And instead of allowing it to keep falling, they created a cartel, some organized group of investors to keep the price high and rising. So they're going short strategy failed, and investors who entered the market sequentially started to lose more money, until eventually people started losing a fortune. So
are all these people shorting it as well?
Not too drowned in theory, because I try to bring these things to the masses. It's a play on the market. It's a strategy. And I think the lesson here is that, like any good strategy, you can win or lose.
Yeah. So you had some situations where hedge funds were losing money, and the so-called little guy was making money.
Yeah, correct. That's what you read, right? Because the hedge funds are big enough and they have enough wealth that they can sell short, and when the market turns against them, they can continue to increase their position to try to stabilize their position. And in this case, blindly, not realizing that there were these forces competing against them, until finally they couldn't afford to buy back the shares. And then they started to crash. And as you said, And if anybody took the time to watch the movie The Big Short, which came out a few years ago, the quote-unquote little guy did very well, and some large hedge funds found themselves out of business. And I think it's a fascinating story, and I think that there's really two directions that this can teach us. I don't recommend that everybody jump into the market and start shorting the market. I think that, well, first of all, I don't recommend everyone just jumping into the market, because I think you should educate yourself. But what does it mean, I think, in terms of, you and I talk a lot about broadly what is an economy and what does it mean? And I think in terms of what would I like people to take out of this lesson is that, number one, like any other market, the stock market can be manipulated, and it is absolutely nothing more than a gamble. I think people should realize that expectations can be wrong. Short-term fluctuations can be very aggressive and very powerful, and things like shorting are a very, very risky play. And then again, in even more general terms, let's just never forget that demand and supply are equally powerful forces. People do get together, and there is collusive behavior in any capitalist economy. We like to call them cartels. Some people call them collusion. Any way you slice it, ask yourself why the price of gas keeps changing at the same time all over the city. And then at the end of the day, people who lose money are angry, and people who make money are very happy. And again, that's just the nature of the stock market. I think sometimes it looks very, very seductive to people to jump in. But if you're doing that without educating yourself, it's like walking up to a craps table in Las Vegas, never having understood anything about craps, and saying, toss me the dice.
Yeah, whenever I've stood outside a casino, I've always said to whoever's been with me, they didn't build that place because they lose.
Oh, they didn't lose? No, of course not. Las Vegas is a city built on very, very poor math. And if you want to see some of the most pathetic things you've ever heard, I've only been to Vegas twice. Stand outside a casino and listen to people. And I'll tell you two quick stories. I remember the bus going by in Vegas, and it said that the Stratosphere Hotel pays back 91%. And I heard a gentleman on the street go, I can't get 91% at my bank. And so I walked up to that gentleman, because I was kind of an arrogant 25-year-old, and I said, you think that's a good deal? And he said, I can't get 91%. And I said, I'll make you a deal. You give me every dollar bill in your wallet, and I'll give you back 91 cents. And he said, that's not what the bus said. And I said, that's exactly
what the bus said.
And he was done.
What the bus said.
And then my other favorite story involved my mom's brother. And he came home from Vegas, and he was bragging about how he got his breakfast, lunch, and dinner comped at the hotel all 4 days he was there. And so he was bragging, and he had this continental breakfast and his steak dinner, and he was bragging to beat the band about all this free food he got in Las Vegas. And so I said to my uncle, I said, how much did you lose at the table? He said, about $30,000.
Listen, I'll leave this with you. You know that line, and don't go away because we want to talk to you some more after the break. But you know that line, whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? You know what stays in Vegas? The money that you brought with you. That's what stays in Vegas. It's like the guy who said, I arrived in Las Vegas in a $200,000 Rolls Royce, and I left in a $500,000 Greyhound bus. Just hold on, Dr. Cam. We're going to come back. I want to talk about the Canadian economy as well. Where is Canada's economy after close to $400 billion in 2020 deficit? $1 trillion national debt. Provinces racking up additional debt. Businesses locked down, some provinces more than others. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business warning 181,000 small business owners may close their doors for good, with 2.4 million jobs in jeopardy. Keystone XL canceled, and other pipeline projects in jeopardy. For some reason, some people in this country gloat about that. Get your head straight. And America's new president, Buy American policy, with a policy office to enforce this in Washington. That's not going to be good for Canada. And COVID is not under control. And so we're going to bury ourselves in additional debt, cause more mental health anguish, see more jobs disappear. 1.3 million Canadian jobs recently disappeared over a 6-month period. And we'll wait for COVID vaccines, which are molasses slow in arriving. More with Dr. Eric Camp, and we'll talk about the Canadian economy, where we are if we're headed to a spring election. Don't go away. It's the Roy Green Show.
You could have started with that instead of this stock market breakdown.
valid and authorized under these various statutes.
Yeah, I think that's a oversimplistic view of this. I mean, quite frankly, to simply say that an administration that President Biden, and by the way, I made the same arguments about President Trump's executive actions too. The notion that you simply refer loosely to a statute and say, oh, we're just implementing it. We're just, shaping implementation so that it fits with our administration's priorities is bogus. This is really about using that as a cover to advance really significant policy change in some cases, and to advance it in a way that I think is extra legal, that is extra constitutional, and should worry anybody that cares about the constitutional design of our system. Again, I think that's why a lot of these executive actions, frankly, a lot of the executive actions that Trump took do get challenged in court, because they precisely because it's not just about taking a law and interpreting it and trying to advance it in a particular way. It's much more pernicious than that, and I think that's the danger.
The vast majority of Trump executive orders were challenged over administrative procedure. In other words, the fact that they didn't undo or repeal or change various regulations in the proper way with a notice and comment period and proper time to respond. It wasn't necessarily that they were overstepping their constitutional authority in every case. It's that they weren't following the law in the way that they could exercise that authority. As far as I'm concerned, all these things are statutory. Congress granted this authority to the president to implement these laws. And if Congress doesn't like it, they can repeal that authority at any time. And, I just feel like these laws are available, and we need to have tangible progress on a host of
on Russia. Out on the street, marching for democracy, freedom, and against corruption.
On Point with Alex Pearson, weekdays at 6:30 p.m. or anytime from Apple and Spotify podcasts. We are 640 Toronto.
In 2021, how about these two resolutions for the new year? Spending quality time with your family and making hearing health part of your routine checkups. Right now at Hearing Life Canada, we're offering 100 bonus air miles to complete a hearing test, plus 1,000 more on your first hearing aid purchase. Don't spend another year with untreated hearing loss that can affect your overall health and your relationships. That's why Hearing Health and Hearing Life are essential. Book now at hearinglife.ca/hearnow.
Hearing Life Canada.
Forget about checking in 3, 4, or 5 times a day. We'll keep you hooked morning to night. We are your news talk leader, 640 Toronto.
Did you see somebody sneeze into a book?
We're back. Dr. Neil Rao will join us later on, infectious diseases specialist and associate professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. Dr. Rao is going to talk to us about COVID-19. He has some very strong feelings and views, and he's shared some of them, many of them with us in the past. So we'll have that for you later. Dr. Eric Kam is with us, macroeconomist, professor of economics at Ryerson University. So, Professor Kam, when we look at the economy of this country, and we're still speculating there'll be a spring election, the vaccine rollout's going to have a lot to do with whether or not that happens. As Daryl Bricker from Ipsos told us yesterday, but where do we stand? We have $1 trillion spent since 2019. We're just talking about the stock market. Where's the return on that? Where's the in tandem with spending economic growth strategy? Mr. Trudeau talks about building back better. Building back what? Where's the strategy beyond borrowing many more billions of dollars? Do you see anything really of significant value here?
No, and in fact, I'm probably going to flush any opportunity I had to speak at the Liberal convention, but I see absolutely nothing solid in anything coming out of the Prime Minister's office right now. I mean, you talk about the return. There is no return as per se. There's only two ways to look at the economy. Things are either in nominal terms or they're in real terms. Nominal terms are in dollars, and while they're interesting to discuss, they're not valuable. We can't make comparisons across countries or our own country year after year if all we're doing is dealing in nominal terms. And I always use this as an example for people, and they tend to like it, which is if I tell you you have $1,000 in your wallet, is that a lot of money? And, you know, my students all say, yes, it is. But if you don't know the price of what you're going to buy, then that amount of money is useless. So it's, for me, it's purchasing power.
Did you say
in
that
real
when you asked the
terms
question?
that I want to talk about growth. And this strategy has nothing to do with growth. And I will not use the name of a popular company in this country. But there is an industry that will come into your home, and instead of fixing the structural issues in your home, they will, in a sense, put a facelift or a cover on any room in your house and make it look brand new. And so while it structurally or functionally looks like a brand new whatever room you want to talk about, it's still rotting under what they have installed. And I really liken that, sadly, to what's going on in the economy right now. They're giving away hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's, again, in nominal terms. So it's keeping money in people's wallets. But it's not really accounting at all for any type of real growth, because there is none. There is effectively no private sector growth right now. Even industries that are quote-unquote doing well can't overcompensate for the other industries that are at dead zero or even marginally above zero. We've talked about the transportation industry, and my aunt, who's a travel agent, said it couldn't get worse. Well, Thursday it got worse as the airlines announced they're not going to sun destinations. So I guess I get really tired of the government trying to put lipstick on this by saying we're keeping money in your wallet. Yes, you are. You are keeping money in people's wallets, but I know I'm starting to ramble and we're up against the clock, but the economy is not a magic lever. It is not suspended animation. You can't just stop an economy like Larry King wants to do with his body and then bring it out of cryogenic freezing years later. There's going to be so little left, and the startup cost to bringing it back is going to be so high, I don't think Canadians are well informed.
No, and you know, where's the international investment in Canada over the longer term? Where would investors place massive amounts of money? Used to be the energy sector, but that golden goose was strangled. Bills C-48 and 69 took care of some of that. And what's being produced in Canada? What does the $2.4 billion Strategic Innovation Fund actually do to drive the economy in a focused and globally competitive arena? Nothing.
Absolutely nothing. I mean, it's got to be focused on the real drivers of economic growth, and that's either got to be consumption, investment, or technological advance, and it's taking care of all but three of those things. It is, Roy, we've talked about this before, we'll talk about it again. The government is keeping liquidity in the economy to a certain minimum level, and they want to get a lot of applause for that, and I guess if you set the bar low enough, you're going to get over it. But I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It's not cryogenically frozen. Right now, they're pretending it is. And when they reopen this economy, the difficulties they're going to have, they think they can just, drop a writ and at 9:01 a.m. start a fledgling economy to take off exactly where we left off last March. And they are kidding themselves. The economic downturn that we are in is far worse than people have any idea.
Yeah, well, Professor Cam, Canadians who kept their jobs have saved money, and that is going to help drive, with consumption when people start to spend again. But that money's finite. It's not investment money.
It's not investment money, and I'm glad that you brought up investment money so we can end the way we began.
We have 30 seconds. They're all yours.
Okay, what a lot of people have to do right now is, again, go back to our first example and talk about their tolerance for risk and uncertainty. People have their own. They can't be talked in or out of it, and it's got to be respected to figure out what am I going to do with the wealth that I have. So I think that we've got to talk about risk in future episodes. We've got to talk about uncertainty. And if you want to talk about what are people doing with their savings right now, they are not investing in Canada right now. Nobody is. And I don't even want to go on anymore because I'm going to be called overly negative tomorrow on Twitter.
Well, you're always called welcome on this program, and my listeners get in touch with me regularly, well, every day, and ask for you to come back. So thanks for the time today, and we certainly have a lot more to talk about. Thank you, Dr. Cam.
My pleasure, Roy. Be well.
You too. Dr. Eric Cam, Professor of Macroeconomics at Ryerson University. When we come back, Preston Manning and his open letter to the Federal Justice Minister Lockdown rules are violating our rights. I'm calling on the Justice Minister to intervene. Stay with us. It's the Chorus Radio Network.
Making a choice about childcare can be stressful. Start the year off right by choosing WeWatch, a licensed.
We're trying to move this thing along as quickly as possible.
Lonnie, actions are aimed at reversing executive actions from the Trump administration. Do you find those legally or constitutionally suspect in the way that you might find some other executive actions? I mean, if this was the policy and practice in the Obama administration, Trump used his powers to change it, and Biden's changing it back. It seems like if it was permissible then, it should be permissible now.
Yeah, I think there's a couple points to make here. First of all, if all Biden is doing is overturning what Trump did, then the question we have to return to is, was the original action undertaken in many cases during the Obama administration, was that legal or not? And for example, I think a lot of people have debated the way essentially in which the DACA program was created via informal agency guidance issued by the Department of Homeland Security back many years ago. The question is essentially, can you take that and bend it one way or the other based on what your political preferences are? And I think that ends up being a very challenging thing, not the least of which for people who are implicated in that policy. And that's why immigration reform is one of these areas that fundamentally I do think needs to happen through the legislative process. It needs to happen through the legislative process, first of all, because it's incredibly complex, and chances are that if you try to change elements of admission status to the United States via executive action, you're going to end up in court and throwing people's lives into disarray. You have to do this via the legislative process to create certainty and to ensure that those who are affected by the policy aren't jerked around from one administration to another, which is essentially what we have now. Which is why I do applaud the effort. I think it's an important effort to try and get immigration reform through the Congress, to do it in a way that ensures it's lasting and durable. And that's a process at the end of the day that I think is the right way to do this. So you're not going back and forth on a subject area that does create a lot of human turmoil. And I think that's the challenge with how Obama did it originally. Then Trump went through the executive action process to essentially say, we're not going to do it that way. And now Biden is reverting back to what I think is the flawed original guidance from the Obama administration.
Priscilla, I want to ask you about that legislative outlook, but first I want to ask about what David mentioned about the humanitarian situation on the U.S.-Mexico border. The Biden administration has signaled that it intends to make changes there, but maybe not very quickly. And back in 2014, the migrant crisis that the Obama administration faced was a significant problem, and not just a political problem, but a situation where they were not finding good or easy answers about how to address that. So is there a sense of how quickly things will change at the border and what they will be doing to improve conditions there without causing an unsustainable flow of migrants to the border?
That is the question. It is one of the most challenging things that is facing the Biden administration when it comes to immigration, because frankly, it's a much more difficult situation that we're seeing on the border, because there are two things happening. We have several thousand migrants who are at the southern border who are waiting for their immigration court date in the U.S. This was under the Trump era policy, formerly known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. And so they have been coming into the U.S. for their court date and then back to Mexico, where they have to remain until their case is concluded. That had delays, of course, because of the pandemic when the immigration courts had to close. But the point being that we have several thousand. Last I checked, there were more than 22,000 pending cases along the border courts from this policy. So you have that, and then you could also have continued flows to the southern border, given the deteriorating conditions in Central America. Not only were they reeling from the pandemic, but they've also were hit by two hurricanes, which destroyed regions. And so there's several push factors kind of happening there too. And then, of course, is the COVID overlay. So this is all incredibly complicated because the Biden administration has said that they want to end the so-called remain in Mexico policy. But how do you do that with the COVID overlay on top of that? Do you isolate vulnerable people and try to have them come into the U.S. and continue their court cases while here in the U.S.? How do you deal with processing? Do you test migrants? These are all questions that they are having to think through, and they're certainly a priority because they do have to address this population of people. And I think this all dovetails into the legislation as well. If you want to pass immigration reform, it's incredibly complicated, as we've all seen over the years. And it's a hard thing to balance if you're also dealing with a crisis on the border. So you're sort of looking at two things at once, simultaneously trying to manage the situation at the border while also pushing through reform, which is ultimately what is going to make the most permanent change.
What are the legislative prospects for that? Because my cynical take on it, maybe it was too cynical when this plan was announced, was that this doesn't look like something that can get through Congress, but that the Biden administration knows and expects that the necessarily slow change of pace through the executive actions that they will take on immigration may be disappointing to certain people in Democratic Party coalition, and so they want to come out with this big, ambitious proposal, whether or not it actually can pass Congress in anything resembling this form. Do you have a sense? Are they really serious about trying to get this through Congress, and what's the strategy for doing that?
The way that the top White House officials are talking about this is that the bottom line is that some reform needs to happen, because as much as you can change policies through executive authority, again, that's not going to have permanent change. And I think DACA, for example, is a great example of that. It happened under Obama, the Obama administration. They were already in limbo, thrown more into limbo under the Trump administration when it volleyed through the courts. And now, DREAM Act, it's been more than a decade, if not two. So the question is, can we provide permanent change for them, of have citizenship on top of some other immigrants in the country, those under temporary protected status, and essential workers and so on. But I think you're right. We've seen this happen before. We've seen reform attempts before. We have to see the details of the legislation. Remember, we've seen the summary, but we haven't seen the fine text. And so that is going to be important in deciding the way forward. But I think something that I've gathered in talking to folks is that I think there's a recognition that it can be broken up into pieces. So maybe it's not the full package, but it's parts of it. And moving through that piecemeal could be a way forward.
Lonnie, what do you make of that? Because I look at this very narrow Democratic majority in Congress and a Republican Party that I think has moved well to the right on immigration compared to where it was when George W. Bush was president. When you say that there needs to be a legislative solution, what do you see as a path through that could actually get significant buy-in from Republicans and move through this Congress?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's going to be much more likely that pieces of this get broken off and you see different coalitions coming together for it. It is a challenge with the makeup of the Senate right now in particular. There's no question about it. I mean, and the Senate's really where the ballgame is, because the Democrats can do whatever they want in the House. I do think it's a challenge, and probably is going to it's going to take a few years. I mean, I don't think it's something that's going to happen overnight. The politics of immigration to me have become remarkably frustrating, because it seems to me, at least from my perspective, and again, I may not be illustrative of a lot of people, in my part of the political coalition, but I think this is one area that we have to get right. We have to get it right, not just because people's lives are at stake, but also because the future of our country's success depends on it. And I think fewer and fewer Republicans, unfortunately, take that point of view. I wish more would recognize that this is a really significant issue, and that we do need to take action urgently on it, because if we don't, we're going to continue going into these back and forth cycles that end up becoming, I think, just as politically polarizing, if not more, than actually just having a debate over the immigration law. And the times when we've had the opportunity to do it, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get there for a variety of different reasons, some of which is related to Republicans standing in the way. Back a few years ago, I could argue, of course, presidential leadership from President Obama wasn't quite at the level it should have been to lead this effort. So maybe Joe Biden will have a different approach. But I don't have an easy answer for you, Josh, because the political environment right now is clearly not going to tolerate a big immigration reform bill. Maybe pieces of it can get through. Maybe there's a little bit more support for the Dreamers, even amongst some parts of the Republican coalition. But broad and more comprehensive reform probably is going to take some more time.
David, what do you think about that piecemeal approach? Because I know that's been controversial in the past. One question, I mean, for example, if you enact the DREAM Act, does that make it harder to do a broader legalization of people who are currently living in the U.S. without authorization, because you've sort of broken off the most sympathetic part of that population? And so that's been part of why there's been a push historically among Democrats to try to do immigration reform in a comprehensive way. Do you think a piecemeal approach is advisable, and do you think that there are key pieces of this that you could get through this Congress if you took a piecemeal approach?
I think that was the initial theory, and that animated the idea of comprehensive immigration reform. I think now there's more of a sense that you need to make as much progress as you can, and if that means a standalone solution for the Dreamers, then that's what it means. I obviously agree with Lanhi that this is going to be incredibly challenging. I will say that Republicans kind of shied away from immigration in the 2020 cycle, and that includes President Trump, who really didn't talk about immigration very much. There have been changes, if you look at public opinion polling, in terms of more sympathy for immigration, more approval of it. That doesn't necessarily raise to the political levels of the Republican Party, which is why I think it's going to be challenging. But it is interesting that whereas in 2016, Trump really ran on a very restrictionist approach to immigration, he did not do that in his reelection campaign, suggesting that there was enough blowback from the policies that he did put into place that it was difficult for him to continue on that path. And maybe that down the road pays a dividend in terms of a broader solution on immigration. I don't think the Republican Party is there right now. The question of whether you can get bits and pieces is one that should be explored, but I'm not sure that that's going to make much headway either.
Priscilla, before we go, we're about to get what I would say is the first really prominent vote in this Congress on immigration, but it's not a legislative vote. It's a confirmation vote on Alejandro Mayorkas to be the Secretary of Homeland Security. This is the first cabinet nomination where you've had Republicans use a filibuster and force Democrats to overcome that filibuster, which only takes 50 votes for a nomination, but it adds some amount of time to what it takes to get the nomination through the Senate. So what do you make of the controversy over Mayorkas? Is that basically just a proxy fight over immigration policy, and how much Republican support is Mayorkas likely to get for his ultimate confirmation?
Well, I think we saw some divisions during the committee vote. So the first vote that he had to undergo, we had Romney, who said that he would vote for Mayorkas, Johnson, who was more skeptical. So we saw some factions within the Republican Party who had skepticism about the way he would approach immigration, the way he would approach the border wall and border security. But I think this is a good time as any to remind listeners that the Department of Homeland Security has not had a confirmed secretary since April of 2019. So that's nearly 2 years of functioning under acting leadership, and many leaders at that. And so this is an incredibly important moment for the Department of Homeland Security to once again have permanent confirmed leadership that can lead the direction during a time that's not only focused on immigration, but also domestic threats and cybersecurity. So we will see that vote on Monday and anticipate that he'll be confirmed Monday evening, and continue to see the rollout of announcements after that from the White House.
Priscilla Alvarez is an immigration reporter at CNN. Thank you very much, Priscilla.
Thank you.
I've been talking with David Dayen of the American Prospect and Lanhi Chen of the Hoover Institution. We will be back to talk for some reason about GameStop. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
You're hearing civilized yet provocative opinions from all sides. Now we need to know what you think. Tweet us at LRC-KCRW. Stream all episodes of Left, Right, and Center and our companion show, All the President's Lawyers, at kcrw.com/podcasts or from the KCRW app.
back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm your host, Josh Barrow. On the right is Lan Hee Chen, fellow at the Hoover Institution. On the left is David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect. Something very stupid has been happening on Wall Street this week. The video game retailer GameStop, which was trading around $18 or $20 a share a month ago, has soared to $300 off enthusiasm from a Reddit message board. It's part of a broader trend of individual investors piling into stocks that certain hedge funds have been selling short. The funds have been betting that these stocks will go down because, for example, GameStop is unprofitable and physical retail of video games is a declining business. But when other investors start buying like crazy, it forces short sellers to start buying stock too because they have to cover their increasingly costly short positions. That buying pushes the stock up higher and drives other shorts to buy. This is called a short squeeze, which pushes the price up, and it's causing a lot of pain at certain hedge funds that probably got into recklessly large short positions in GameStop in the first place. But the end result of this is going to be that lots of retail investors, many of them unsophisticated, you can look at the App Store downloads and you can see how Robinhood, the trading app, is the #1 download on the iPhone this week. They're buying GameStop at a price that implies it's worth as much as Best Buy, which is a much bigger company that actually makes money. So what's going to happen to them when the fad is over and GameStop falls back to a price that reflects its actual financial prospects? This is a finance story, but it also has significant political elements. The retail GameStop buyers have gotten rhetorical support from populist politicians on the right and on the left. Ted Cruz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez both wanted to know why retail brokers were restricting purchases of GameStop just as the company's stock was going crazy. AOC tweeted, "We now need to know more about Robinhood app's decision to block retail investors from purchasing stock while hedge funds are freely able to trade the stock as they see fit." So, David, is equal access to stupid investments a left principle now? Because this is a talking point I've heard a lot from the right. We've had arguments over the last few years about whether it should be easier for regular people to invest in private companies. A lot of people on the left have warned that this is something that will open up investors to scams. Isn't that, shouldn't we be a little more concerned about retail investors getting into this rather than being so focused on protecting their access?
Well, you said at the top there that something stupid happened on Wall Street this week, and I would broaden that out, that something stupid always happens on Wall Street. I think what this episode shows is that there is a certain amount of market manipulation on Wall Street that is intolerable, and that the system that was set up and that lore suggests is still true, that these stocks reflect the expected future profits or some sort of productive activity that they're doing is rather artificial. And so I think that this should lead to a broader inspection of these markets and what is actually happening regarding manipulation within them. Fortunately, the Biden administration has Gary Gensler, who is a pretty aggressive regulator, about to be placed as the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I think he should undergo a significant amount of investigation and regulation to look at the broader implications of what's happening here.
Lan Hee, do you see policy lessons in this episode?
Well, I mean, this is the challenge, right? It's not clear to me, and I've talked to some folks and done a little bit of thinking and research on this myself. It's just not clear to me what the right policy intervention is in this case. Look, by the way, the problem with GameStop is that you walk in and you can't find anything. I mean, that's the problem with GameStop. But beyond that, it's just that it's not clear to me that what is the right policy lever to pull? So, for example, is the question, do we need to make sure that investors have a better sense of financial literacy before they, start trading, in things that potentially could get them into a lot of trouble? And financial literacy was very hot, back in the Dodd-Frank era when the Dodd-Frank Act was first, legislated and signed into law. Fell off a little bit during the Trump administration. Should we be requiring enhanced consumer disclosures? Is that something we would look at? It's just not clear to me what the exact intervention is to address the issue at hand. And for that reason, it feels to me like this is a story that has captured people's minds in part because of some of the companies involved. Some of the companies are, kind of iconic in certain circles. There's a lot of intrigue around this back and forth, this David and Goliath between the retail investors and the big institutional investors. But at the end of the day, beyond sort of, Elizabeth Warren saying, well, we got to do something about this, and Ted Cruz saying, yeah, we got to do something about this, and AOC saying the same, at the end, I'm left a little bit unsatisfied because it's not clear to me what the exact intervention is and what's the problem we're trying to solve for in this situation. Are we trying to say that hedge funds can't take large short positions? I don't think that's a good policy conclusion at all. Are we saying that investors shouldn't be allowed to do the kind of high volume trading they're doing? Well, then that's going to put a whole, a bunch of people out of business who are retail investors. So it's just not clear to me what the right intervention is. And so at the end of the day, I don't think this is a policy problem so much as it's a financial markets social kind of story. And, we'll have to see where it goes. But to me, at least, there doesn't seem to be an immediate policy answer here.
I think there are a number of policy answers, and maybe they come from my own idiosyncratic perspective, but I don't think hedge funds should exist. I think you should close the loopholes in the Investment Company and the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 that allowed them to flourish, and that would mandate disclosure, but also alter their fee structures and eliminate the use of leverage, which of course spins up these things into much larger positions than they could otherwise be. If you repealed Section 209 of the National Securities Markets Improvement Act of 1996, which allowed endowments and pension funds to get into hedge funds, making them increase tenfold in 7 years, you would go a long way to tamping down the, I feel, very unproductive activity in the public markets. You can crack down on market manipulation like pump and dump schemes, which the GameStop thing is a form of, quite frankly. The SEC could do that without new legislation. The Federal Reserve and the Financial Stability Oversight Council could restrict significant bank lending to hedge funds, which again uses leverage to increase these positions massively and create a lot of cascading problems potentially through the system. And you can ban certain speculative trading products that have no real productive value. I would say naked short selling, where you're selling and trading and making bets on stocks that you don't own, is one of them. Or the circumstance, which was true in GameStop's case, where the short selling position is more than 100% of the existing stock. I think there's a lot that you can do. And then the final thing would be, the sort of Pigovian tax that you would use normally if you want to discourage certain activity, which would be a financial transaction tax on short-term plays. So I think there are a number of policy things that this episode illuminates, things that I think should have been done a long time ago. But I think that the fact that what we see right now in the markets has transpired, I think it's shown a bright spotlight on these issues, and I think that the Biden team should take action.
I want to stick up for the usefulness of price discovery and how that the markets are not ordinarily so stupid as they are this week, and the usefulness of short selling, which is to say that, I think it is a good first approximation that stock prices reflect the expected future earnings of companies, because that's why the stock market goes up over time, and it moves in line with after-tax corporate profits, which move somewhat in line with economic growth, although things change what share of the economy show up as after-tax corporate profits. If stock prices were basically random, you wouldn't have that long run upward trend. And the reason that we focus not just on this story, but you have conversations about, is Tesla's valuation reasonable? Does Uber's valuation make any sense? People talk about those because those companies are weird. Normally, you expect the valuation of a company to line up with its actual financial performance, which we should want for a number of reasons, because that makes it easier for companies that have better prospects to raise capital. Also because executives are compensated based on how the stock does. So hopefully the move in the stock price those ought to be associated with the underlying economic condition of the company. Otherwise, executives are being paid to do the wrong thing. But then short sellers play a small but significant role in this ecosystem, which is to say that when you have companies that are overvalued, they're the ones who actually put money on the line and try to expose why they're overvalued. And that can be valuable in the sense that, you know, that was something that helped expose Enron. That's something that helped expose Wirecard, the German payments company that was revealed to have a significant accounting scandal over the last several months. And we can look at what a market without shorts looks like, because the private market is a market without shorts. And you had Theranos, which went on for a decade with no product and burned through $1 billion and ended up with the non-functioning product rolling out in Walgreens stores, in part because nobody had a financial incentive to prove to the world that Theranos' product didn't work. We had to wait for an investigative journalist to figure that out. So I think that, you know, that you can always identify significant problems with the public markets, and I'm sure that there are regulatory improvements that could reduce those. But I think people sort of are a little bit too negative on this process that actually does a fair amount to improve the efficiency of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a bit of an overlooking on your part of the ordinary business of touting, busting up, breaking down various companies by activist hedge funds, which we've seen over a large period. I think we're ignoring sort of the rise of algorithmic trading that is disconnected in many ways to you know, even people's ordinary wants or desires in terms of the stock markets. We saw that with the flash crash several years ago, which was caused by someone hitting a button wrong. I mean, I think there are bigger problems than you indicate that maybe aren't seen in the aggregates, but are seen in many, many specific examples. And I don't have a problem with short selling per se. I agree with you in terms of its potential function. I have a problem with the types of short selling that goes on where there's not even an underlying ownership of the stock. And at that point, it's just bets. I mean, I think we can separate what is productive within the public markets with what is completely unproductive. And I think this is a moment that we can attack those unproductive elements and rid them from the system. It would only make the system more efficient and better.
We've reached that time once again for our famed left, right, and center rants featuring pet peeves from across the political spectrum. David Dayen, what's your rant?
Well, California ended its stay-at-home order this week, and in pandemic-ravaged Los Angeles, where I am, restaurants opened for outdoor dining on Friday, the same day as a driving rainstorm, and I think that should maybe be taken as an omen. The steady decrease in cases and hospitalizations that seems to be triggering this in California and nationwide is likely to be a false dawn, I'm sorry to say. More contagious variants, which have already appeared here, will rapidly become the dominant strain, just as a mathematical matter, within weeks or maybe a couple months. We're in sort of a terrible race between that reality and the consequent final and potentially very deadly outbreak, and vaccinating enough people to blunt the worst effects. We only have about a month or two, and we can win this race by accelerating vaccination and taking maximum precautions in the final stretch. But opening up patios to capacity for pizza and beer seems to send a tragically wrong signal in this moment.
Lonnie Chen, what's on your mind?
Well, act first and avoid questions later. That's the mantra that California Governor Gavin Newsom has followed through the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic. His latest decision to suddenly lift shelter-in-place orders across much of the state came as a surprise even to lawmakers of his own party, who complained about Newsom's lack of communication and go-it-alone style. The bigger problem for Californians is that the governor's erratic decision-making, where edicts come down from Sacramento without a clear rationale or presentation of the data underlying them. One day we're completely shut down, and then the next we're not. Californians know the final decisions that Newsom reaches, but there's no transparency to help them understand the how and why. This isn't how government at any level in this country should be making policy. It's time for Newsom and other leaders across America to understand that leaving citizens in the dark only worsens the distrust that already exists between the governing and the governed.
For my rant, the school board of San Francisco has voted to rename 44 schools that are currently named after such boogie persons as Abraham Lincoln, Paul Revere, and Dianne Feinstein. They came up with a list of reasons why people might be offended by these various names. Now, they have voted on this renaming. They spent a 7-hour meeting discussing this before they voted on this renaming at a time when these school buildings are closed. They're closed to students because of the pandemic. And as Mayor London Breed has pointed out, why are you spending time on this when you should be spending time trying to figure out how to get kids back in the classroom? People overuse the term political correctness, but this is absolutely a case of political correctness and one that is especially ill-timed. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Lan Hee Chen, David Dayan, and Priscilla Alvarez. Left, Right, and Center is produced by Sarah Fay. Our technical director is JC Swadek. Todd and Simon composed our theme music. I'm Josh Barrow. Thank you for joining us, and tune in next week for more Left, Right, and Center.
Download and subscribe at kcrw.com/LRC, the KCRW app, or wherever you find podcasts. Left, Right, and Center is produced and distributed by KCRW.
You're listening to the All News Channel from member-supported KCRW.
Have a smartphone? Check out the KCRW apps for iPhone, Android, and BlackBerry. KCRW's unique blend of news, music, and culture is as close as your pocket, purse, or fanny pack. More at kcrw.com/apps.
Today on the New Yorker Radio Hour, I'll talk with Pastor William Barber, who preached at the inaugural prayer service for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. For years, Reverend Barber has worked to bring Christianity back into politics, but not in the way we've come to expect it.
When Jesus, the ultimate evangelical, right, his first sermon said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor." If your attention is not on dealing with the issues that hurt the poor, the brokenhearted, the sick, the left out, the stranger, and all of those who are made to feel unacceptable, you have heresy.
We'll talk this hour about faith, religion, and policy as a new administration is underway in Washington. And we'll hear a live performance from the singer and songwriter Kurt Vile. That's all ahead on the New Yorker Radio Hour.
Well, I woke up this morning.
Live from NPR News, I'm Barbara Klein. A group of 10 Republican senators is asking for a White House meeting to discuss their alternative COVID relief package to President Biden's $1.9 trillion proposal. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana tells Fox News the plan could win bipartisan support.
Ours is about $600 billion. We are very targeted.
He says the plan matches Biden's funding for vaccinations, but sharply decreases funding to help schools reopen for in-person classes. The GOP senators say their plan narrows eligibility for economic relief, targeting those with the greatest need. It also extends enhanced federal unemployment benefits at the current level. Top Biden advisor Brian Deese says the president is open to ideas, but uncompromising on the need to move with speed on a comprehensive approach. Chicago public school officials want to restart in-person learning tomorrow, but Sarah Karp of member station WBEZ reports their plan will be derailed if the school district can't make a deal with its teachers union.
In Chicago, teachers and staff are refusing to work in person until an agreement is reached, and if they're blocked from teaching remotely, they're threatening to strike. At a virtual rally yesterday, American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten told them to keep fighting.
So we are with you every step of the way. The demands from the CTU are what science says we need to do. It's the pathway to safety. And so we are going to fight like you know what.
The school district and the union announced yesterday that they had agreements on 4 issues, including ventilation and safety protocols. For NPR News, I'm Sarah Kirk in Chicago. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is summoning state governors to meet tomorrow morning to address the country's slow vaccine rollout. Esme Nicholson reports just over 2% of the population has received an initial dose so far. According to Merkel's office, representatives from major vaccine manufacturers and from the EU Commission are due to join her and Germany's 16 state governors to find solutions to the major shortfall in vaccines. Speaking to the Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper on Sunday, Federal Health Minister Jens Spahn said there's no reason why the coronavirus vaccines from China and Russia couldn't be used in Europe, providing they're approved by the European Medicines Agency. While the EMA granted full approval of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine on Friday, Germany's health authorities recommend it is given only to those under the age of 65, citing a lack of trial data about efficacy in the elderly. For NPR News, I'm Esme Nicholson in Berlin. This is NPR. The pandemic has disrupted the choreography of Broadway sketches. Down more than 10 months ago, Tony Award nominations for the shortened seasons were announced late in October, and the planned award ceremony never happened. And now Jeff London reports it's been announced Tony voting will take place in March, and the awards will be presented in coordination with Broadway's reopening. The 784 Tony voters, producers, industry members, and press will be allowed to vote between March 1st and 15th for a small slate of Broadway shows, but because of the shortened season, none of the nominated musicals have original scores, and only one leading man is eligible to win a Tony for Best Actor in a musical. When Broadway reopens depends on the delivery of vaccines. The American Theater Wing and Broadway League, which sponsor the Tonys, wouldn't commit to a date for online ceremonies. For NPR News, I'm Jeff London in New York. England's 100-year-old Captain Sir Tom Moore has been hospitalized. Moore drew international attention by walking 100 laps around his garden during the UK's first coronavirus lockdown in order to raise money for the National Health Service. He raised nearly $45 million. Moore's daughter posted on his Twitter feed that he tested positive for COVID-19 and needed help with his breathing. I'm Barbara Klein, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Wallace Foundation, working to develop and share practices that can improve learning and enrichment for young people and the vitality of the arts for everyone. Ideas and information at wallacefoundation.org.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour, a co-production of WNYC Studios and the New Yorker.
Welcome to the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick.
Well, we are in a jam today. Trouble is real. And whether we like it or not, we are in this mess together as a nation. When this word of the Lord came to Isaiah, his people were also in a jam.
The morning after the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the Reverend William Barber delivered the homily for the inaugural prayer service. The prayer service, usually at the National Cathedral, follows the inauguration every 4 years. It's a given, part of the whole ceremony. But the event tells us something about a president's relationship with religion. And in that context, the fact that Reverend Barber was asked to give the homily was deeply significant. Barber is explicitly political in his ministry. He wants government policies to reflect Christian values. His agenda, though, is nearly the opposite of what the Christian right has successfully advanced for so many years in Washington.
We can't accept the poverty and low wealth of 140 million Americans before COVID and many more millions since. We must have a third Reconstruction. We must address the 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false, distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism. These are breaches that must be addressed. And according to the text, repairing the breaches will bring revival.
Barbara is firmly in the center, or more so on the left of the Democratic Party on matters of poverty, voting rights, gay rights, environmental protection, and more. And yet he expresses frustration, deep frustration with the party. He thinks it lacks a coherent, inspiring moral vision to reach the country. Barbara is pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and he's president of a group called Repairers of the Breach. He and I spoke in 2017, not so long after the election of Donald Trump, a very different turning point in our nation's history. Now, you've written, I can't remember a time when I did not know God both to be real and to be about bringing justice in the world, and yet you had what you call serious reservations about the church. What were those reservations?
Two different things. I can't remember a time when God, sense of God, was not formative in my reality, but my father did have some struggle, even within the church, the so-called black church, because there were persons who would say to him, we don't need to be involved in politics. We just need to pray and have praise services and just don't be involved. Dr. King faced the same thing. And, Dr. King was put out of his denomination because of that. So I struggled with that. I said, well, maybe I'll be a lawyer, an attorney. And when I got ready to go to college, I actually looked at the catalogs to make sure there weren't any courses on religion required.
You had had your fill, you thought?
Well, of that, not of God, not of justice, not of love, but the formalized kind of. I was hurting, and I was hurting because of some of the things I'd seen. And then somewhere down the line, had a real strong epiphany. And actually one day I called my father and said, Daddy, I'm wrestling with something. He said, come home, I already know. I said, you already know what? He said, I already know, just come home. And when I went home, we went driving, and he took me down to Nags Head around the beach, and we just drove along the coast of the ocean and talked. And we talked about, theology. We talked about the church. The church is not a perfect entity. Whether or not my work should be inside or outside, the difference between the church as an imperfect entity and the reality of God and reality of justice, reality of love. And I revealed to him that I felt a calling to ministry, and preached my trial sermon in March of 1984.
Now, the Black church writ large has been a sanctuary, a place of truth-telling, a place of relative safety for hundreds of years. And at the same time, particularly in the South, but not only, the evangelical white church has been growing more and more right-wing now for decades. Now, as a young man, did you start sensing this tension between your own church and the growing moral majority and all the other evangelical movements that were growing?
You used a lot of terms that I don't use the same way. So it's going to take me a little bit to pat that.
I've got all night.
Okay. First of all, I'm an evangelical. The Black church has been traditionally evangelical. The term was hijacked because in the Bible, theologically, there's no such thing as an evangelical that does not begin with a critique of systems of economic injustice. And when Jesus, the ultimate evangelical, right, that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew that was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, the ghetto, right, the poor place, his first sermon said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news. That's evangel. That's what that means. To the poor. If your attention is not on dealing with the issues that hurt the poor, the brokenhearted, the sick, the left out, the least of these, the stranger, and all of those who are made to feel unacceptable, you don't have right-wing evangelicalism, you have heresy.
Is that what you would call?
Yes. Yeah. You have theological malpractice. It doesn't fit Orthodox Christianity. What we've had.
So let's break it down for a second. How do you account for the fact that Donald Trump, whose behavior and rhetoric and past is in no way a moral avatar, and his interest in religion is of recent vintage, and yet his support was extremely high in that community, broadly defined.
That's right. By that particular group, it was opposed in a many ways, but yes, okay. And that's where you see now, I think where we can see it so clearly. Those, Kevin Cruz in his book, and others have documented this, when they wanted to speak against, for instance, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, when they wanted to take over elements of the Christian pulpit, they came up with this weird theology. If you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. If you're good, you're wealthy. If you're bad, you're in poverty. It's actually a strange form of Calvinism that just is abusive to Calvinism in itself.
Calvinism with private planes.
No, right. And so,
does Creflo Dollar bother you in that way?
Any of those that simply preach in that way, because it is not consistent with Orthodox theology. It's not consistent with the theology of the Bible. It's not consistent with the critique. But let me make one point.
But how did Trump get such wide?
Well, that's what I'm saying. But if in fact in your theology says whoever is good is wealthy, then you would fawn over a wealthy businessman, right? Because his purse strings.
Despite his moral behavior.
Because maybe the religion you're promoting is really about moral behavior. Maybe it's really a purchase religion, like paid puppets of the empire. Because anytime a religion seems to say the only moral issues are prayer in the school, where you stand on abortion, being against a woman's right to choose, private property, and making sure you can prove that Jesus was a founding member of the NRA, that is not Christianity. Think about it. This is how you can see it, my brother Remnant. They're so loud on things like abortion and prayer in the school, and so wrong and so quiet on things like healthcare and living wages and acceptance of all people and treating the poor. Now, there are 3,500 scriptures in the Bible about love and justice and mercy and how you treat the stranger and how you help the least of these. And it's not talking about private charity either. It's talking about how we shape society. It's talking about the nations. Jesus said, "What I will say to the nations when I was hungry," not the individual, to the nation. That's government. 3,500 scriptures. There may be 3 scriptures about homosexuality. None of them trump the scripture that says you got to love your neighbor as yourself. So how do you claim to be a conservative if you dismiss 3,500 texts, but then build a whole theology around 3 scriptures and most of them you misinterpret? That's not conservative. That's not, because conservative means to hold on to the essence of.
How do you deal with a complex moral issue like abortion in your church, where I would bet there's not unanimity in the pews?
It's not unanimity. First of all, one of the things we say to people is, first of all, let's get the folk out of the room for a minute. We love them, but who want to come in here and talk about a woman's right to choose, and they claim they want the baby to be here, but then they don't want to give the woman health care to get the baby here, or health care to the baby after the baby gets here. They don't want to pay the parents a living wage so they can take care. So you really don't have any credibility to talk about abortion, because all of your policies abort people's possibilities, dreams, and hopes. So you don't need to be in this conversation. Secondly, it's easy. You can be, I'm not pro-abortion. You know, like man said, just go out. That's not even, it's not pro or con. I can say that I believe in life. I want persons to have children. But there are so many situations where that may not be possible. There are situations where people have to choose. And even if they choose to have an abortion, I choose to love. I choose to care for them. What I want to get the conversation to higher ground. And the higher ground is, how do we stop aborting the hopes of the poor? How do we stop destroying healthcare? You think about the hypocrisy of having clergy in the Rose Garden with the president clapping for him signing an executive order about so-called religious leaders, and not chastising him on his position to deny millions of people health care. And they claim to be Christian clergy. Now watch this. This is a very simple country boy analogy. If I'm not mistaken, the one thing Jesus did was set up free health clinics. Everywhere you look in the Bible, Jesus healing folk. He never charged a leper a copay. Now you believe in Jesus now. You believe in Jesus. But you're gonna applaud someone. Something else is going on underneath that's ugly, that's cynical, that doesn't make sense, that's not good for the health of our culture, and is a denial of the basics of our faith. In the word salvation means healing.
Reverend, your most recent book is called The Third Reconstruction. In it you argue that this country needs what you call the Third Reconstruction in order to save the soul of America. Tell me what you mean by that.
I actually believe that much of what we're seeing, we're in the birth pains of the Third Reconstruction, and those who are the adversaries of America reconstructing itself, and who in many ways are the social and political descendants of those who've always fought Reconstruction, they see it happening. If you know history, you understand that what we've seen with Donald Trump is as American as apple pie. It's the call and response of history. The call is more justice, more racial progress. The response is the progress of racism, the fear, and the reaction. And what should surprise us is not so much that Donald Trump used these tactics, but that he and others, Ryan McConnell and others, have been so successful at using them in the 21st century. And one reason I've been writing about the Third Reconstruction is because I think too often, too many people do not know this history. Do not know this history.
I think we're too caught up in the day-to-day hysteria of what's going on.
Sometimes, and just we keep dumbing down politics. We need to understand this history because actually we're seeing it played out. What do we have now? The cry against for tax cuts. What helped to bring it into the Second Reconstruction? Cry about tax cuts. First Reconstruction, the cry about tax cuts, because the tax cut was always about disabling the government from being able to make the playing field more level and fixing the problems that the government created in the first place.
This brings us to your role. Now, you've just changed your life a little bit. You've left your job in the North Carolina NAACP.
I laugh when you say job because I see some folks. It's a volunteer. You don't realize that. The president of the NAACP is work, but it's volunteer. It's purely love, volunteer.
But it's been replaced by something that's potentially much larger, which is to lead a poor people's movement. What does that movement mean?
First of all, last year, from April to November, I did a tour with Dr. James Forbes, former pastor emeritus Riverside, Dr. Liz Theo Harris from Union, Sister Simone Tracy Blackman. We did 22 states, called it the Moral Revival Tour, and we put out a higher ground moral agenda. Thousands of people showed up. Hundreds of clergy activists, even people who are not people of faith, but who believe in the moral arc of the universe, showed up to be trained in moral activism, moral articulation, and moral analysis. It showed us that there was a heart that people know we need, as I said, the convention is a moral defibrillators. People who are willing to say, wait a minute, some of these issues are not about left versus right, they're about right versus wrong. Healthcare is about right versus wrong. Living wage is right versus wrong. Dealing with systemic racism is about right versus wrong. And that we need to stand up not as partisans, but as people of conscience. Something's wrong in the spirit of the country. And we knew that we needed to have this Poor People's Campaign. So we decided, when it comes to prophetic voices, Brother Remnant, you don't simply have commemorations of what they did. I'm kind of tired of commemorations now. Well, we go back and say, back then they did this. You figure out how to reimagine and re-engage what they did and what was the unfinished business.
You've had a movement called the Moral Monday Movement as of 2013, I believe.
Actually, the Forward Together Moral Movement started in 2007 when Democrats were in office. And I want to talk about that because A moral movement can't just challenge extremists who've taken over the Republican Party. We have to challenge reluctant Democrats. And especially right now, I'm very concerned when I hear Democrats talking only about the middle class. They think that's all that went wrong in this past election. One of the things we have to do is recover our moral foundation. When some of these extremists say they want to read the Constitution, I get happy. I said, please, let's read the Constitution. Or when they say we want to talk about what's in the Bible, please, let's have that conversation. Because if we have it, then it will expose the holes in the hypocrisy and may even cause you to repent. And come join us in love.
The church, and not only the black church, but the church and religion were a huge impetus to the civil rights movement. And there were lots of leaders of the civil rights movement, lots of factions and differences of opinion, all the rest. Is the church in the same position that it was in 1954 through the late 60s now to be that moral underpinning? When I was in Charleston, South Carolina after those terrible murders, and spent a lot of time at that church. But when I spoke to younger people in Black Lives Matter movement, it was well outside the church structure. There was a real gap between the older folks in the church, and distinctly older, and the younger movement that was well outside the church. Is that a complication for today's movement?
Well, I'd love you to talk to all the young people that are part of the Moral Monday movement, and many of them are Black Lives Matter and many other groups. See, we're having a little linguistic thing, because to say the church has always been problematic. The church has always been problematic.
Let me put it to you this way: is the progressive movement broadly defined more secular than it was a half century ago?
I think that progressives made a mistake when they walked away from the centerpieces of faith and morality because they were mad with Jerry Falwell. I think progressives make a mistake when we don't know and remember the power of moral underpinning and what power has been. Now, I'm not talking about a movement that says you have to be Christian. That's the genius of the Moral Monday movement. There are people who are atheists that come to our rallies and say amen. What we found is that there are these deep moral foundations that transcend our limits. They transcend our limits. We have figured out a way in North Carolina, and what we figured out on the moral revival, if you look at the groups that came and at all our revivals, we had Black Lives Matter, we had environmentalists, we had Fight for 15. In fact, one time in Birmingham, we were in a Jewish synagogue downtown training 200 activists. We had Muslims, Christians, Jews in a Jewish synagogue, Black Lives Matter, people not of faith, charismatics, policy people, gay and straight, all in the same rooms all day long. And I think that we make a big mistake. When I see progressives now, and I love so many of them, talking about all we got to do is work on the right work middle class. And they're not talking about expanding the electorate when they give every reason for this election, but without dealing with the issue of race. I've said to a group the other day on this election, if you know the history of Reconstruction, not only do you know what has happened as Americans apple pie, you know how to defeat it. It's when we come together, when we're willing to put our minds to work and our bodies on the line. What if we didn't focus on Trump, because Trump is a symptom? And what if we said this is not the end of a movement, but a launch in the movement? And what if we said we will work in our silos sometimes, but we want you to know we're all in this together, and we stand on our deepest moral principles and not just curse the darkness, but point people to the light? What if we use something like that to lend to shock the very heart of this nation? I want to see what would happen if we finish that leg of the Poor People's Campaign. I want to see what would happen if we could come together. And I believe Walter Wink was a great theologian at Union Theological Seminary. He wrote a sermon, I remember reading some years ago, called The Blessings of an Enemy. And this is going to sound strange. Don't y'all get mad. Let me finish. Sometimes you have to look at what your enemy did to defeat you to find your strength. If the forces in this last election, this is not just this last election, this has been a 40-year battle. If, however, in order to win, they had to lie almost every other 10 minutes, they had to find a way to put pornographic sums of money into the electoral pot. They had to spend years pushing voter suppression. They had to use fear against Muslims, against immigrants. If somebody cheats you, they don't cheat you because you're weak. People only cheat you when they can't beat you in a fair fight. Then that says that we are stronger than we realize. And this is not the worst thing we've ever faced. People made it through slavery. People made it through the denial of women's rights. People made it through the depression in this country. People made it through apartheid and Jim Crow. It's our time to stand up and be the moral dissenters, the moral defibrillators, and the moral dreamers, and to make it through this moment and use it to change the course of history, to change America. And in some ways, if we work together, we'll change the world.
Reverend Barber, thank you. Thank you very much. I spoke with William Barber in 2017. He's the pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, president of Repairers of the Breach, and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. In a moment, we'll look at Joe Biden's faith. He's only the second Catholic president ever, and how it may shape his leadership.
I found that there's that famous phrase from Kierkegaard, faith sees best in the dark. I find the one thing it gives me, and I'm not trying to proselytize, I'm not trying to convince you to share my religious views, but for me, it's important because it gives me some reason to have hope and purpose.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour. More to come.
The New Yorker Radio Hour is supported by Atlassian. 83% of Fortune 500 companies use collaboration software from Atlassian, like Jira or Trello, enabling teams to keep aligned to key goals and connected to one another, helping businesses the size of small countries stay agile. Learn more at Atlassian.com. And by Progressive Insurance, committed to providing tools to enable customers to bundle home and auto insurance. Learn more at Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Now that's Progressive.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick. It comes as something of a surprise to remember that President Biden is only the second Catholic to hold the office out of 46 people so far. The first, of course, was John Kennedy. And whether that has any significance to his policies or his leadership is a question that I wanted to ask Paul Eli. Paul writes for us frequently about the Catholic Church and issues of faith, and he's a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Now, Paul, I think we're long past time when discrimination against Catholics was a real force in America. But what do you make of the fact that Biden is only the second Catholic president?
What I think is just how clearly it reveals how dramatically things have changed since Kennedy was elected in 1960. At that moment, you had Franco in power in Spain. You had the church tightly wound in with governments in the countries from which so many American Catholics had come, in Italy and Ireland. The church was deeply tied into governments in Latin America. There was fear that something like that could happen here. That said, I don't think the animus against Kennedy really was about that. I think it was a holdover of a long nativism of American Protestants against Catholics that led the KKK to identify papists as others, as people not like us. So here we are some years later, and I don't think anyone's concerned that the Pope is going to give Joe Biden an order that he must follow. And in some ways, it's rich that actually the people who historically fear such scenarios, people on the left, are now looking to Biden to bring his religion into the mix.
In a way, they want to see some of Pope Francis brought into the mix.
I think that's right. One of the things that distinguishes Biden's Catholicism is that it's not doctrinaire. It tries to make common cause with people of different groups. And he has that in common with Pope Francis. And so there's the hope that Francis's openness, his informality, his flexibility, his confidence that Catholicism is relevant, and the lack of anxiety about its place in any culture war is going to inform Biden's approach to Catholicism as president.
So where do you see the evidence that Biden's religious values, his religious practice, shape his policies?
It's hard to tell. And that's perturbed a lot of people on the right. And it's given a lot of anxiety to certain Catholic bishops who are already concerned that his executive orders go against Catholic teaching, that he's about to enshrine a kind of take it or leave it Catholicism as legitimate in this country. What I see is something much more obvious, but no less important. Biden values institutions. He has a concern for the common good. He likes to speak a language that others speak. And in this case, the language that he speaks that enables him to make common cause with others often has a religious accent. The common good, my brother's keeper, welcome the stranger, and so forth. It's at that level that he can strike a religious note and both embolden people on the left and possibly reach out to people on the right.
Now, I think it's safe to say that Joe Biden is a more devout Christian than his predecessor, certainly a more practicing one, although Trump remains a huge favorite among evangelical voters, despite his not being terribly observant, to say the least. Have American Catholics had the same devotion to Trump?
It breaks down in different ways. Among white Catholics, especially in the heartland, there's a really considerable support for Trump. It's baffled a lot of people. I'm personally baffled by it. What I think is really clear is that there's an equally substantial number of Catholics who are not only supportive of Biden, but are ready to move forward and coalesce around Biden if he can make a few bold moves in policy in his early months and do it in a way that reflects not just a concern for Catholicism, but suggests that he's speaking as one of them.
Biden seemed reluctant earlier in his career to invoke faith in any blatant, obvious way, and he's been more demonstrative about that in later years. Why is that?
Well, David, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One has to do with his personal story. The death of his son, Beau, led him to speak more forthrightly about grief. And then the historical context has changed since the 80s. In the 80s, it was the right, and especially the Catholic right, who urged public officials to conform public policy to their Catholic beliefs. Over the past 3 decades, things have turned in the opposite way, where now you have a Supreme Court justice like Amy Coney Barrett actually insisting during her confirmation hearings that her very deeply held Catholicism will not affect her rulings from the bench. And Biden, on the other side, is more and more comfortable speaking of faith because the ground has softened and faith as public policy is part of the lingua franca of our time.
But isn't that just a difference in the jobs they hold? The Supreme Court justice has to, bob and weave through his or her hearings, whereas a presidential candidate is appealing at a different level.
That's definitely the case. I guess, and this is almost a question for you, I think that President Obama helped now President Biden open up his vocabulary in matters of faith. Barack Obama was very articulate, very convincing on the role that Christianity had played in his life, and then spoke with great power after the church massacre, for example. This showed that a person could speak from the heart on matters of faith without being governed by faith or a slave to faith. And I think Biden was right by his side and picked up on that. What do you think?
Well, I don't really know. President Obama's religion has always been a kind of mystery to me, not that it necessarily should be an open matter, because he was clearly committed to the church he was committed to. But in many ways, it seemed a matter of community as much as it did traditional religious faith.
And I think that that's more true of Biden than maybe we've detected. Yes, he goes to Mass on Sundays. Yes, he carries a rosary. But in a very deep way, he belongs to a Catholic community in the broadest sense. Mm-hmm. This is tens of millions of people who identify with Catholicism in some way, whether it's childhood influence, something they practice now, something that is part of where they came from. And that sense of community, expressed in general language, such as he uses, is really an effective part of his self-presentation. I think it means a lot to him.
Within the Catholic Church, there's so much tension between a liberal-leaning Pope, Pope Francis, and a hierarchy of bishops that's become, if anything, more conservative over time, to a non-Catholic. It's really startling how openly opposed many senior leaders are to Francis, and now we've got a president who's kind of a Francis-type Catholic. How is that going to play out in the political realm, if you can tell?
I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the church and American society are in different circumstances. In America, we're yearning for unity. We feel that we've gone down the road of division as far as we can go, and we need someone to kind of help pull things together. The church, there's been a sham or surface unity that's been observed or imposed for decades and for centuries. Pope Francis has opened things up, and we're now hearing voices of dissent and disagreement that were sotto voce or behind closed doors in previous generations. So a consequence of Francis's openness is the very open disagreements that we're seeing now, and in some ways they're a good thing.
You know, it's interesting to me that some of the ideological backbone of Trumpism, both historically with Pat Buchanan and in contemporary terms with William Barr, comes with particularly conservative Catholics.
I think that's right, and I think the fact of the Second Vatican Council and the history of the Church over the past half century has made it easy to forget just for how long the Catholic Church was the anti-liberal institution, one that was ruled by a quasi-monarch that insisted doctrinally and practically that it could not change, that maintained ties to all sorts of older forms of European absolutism after they were broken down by democracy. And that history is still very powerful for so many people. In a way, that's the history that I think was in play at the Capitol on January 6th. We saw a rugged wooden cross present in that mob like a battering ram. We saw quasi-crusading imagery and a guy claiming the Senate chamber like a conquistador and saying, you know, this space is ours now. That's very old Christian history that's not gone, that's still in play.
Now, the greatest challenge that I think the Catholic Church has faced in the last generation is the abuse scandals, which are so horrific, and there are so many of them. Has Biden taken any firm position on those scandals and the Church's culpability?
I don't know Biden's position in particular. I know that it's the fact of the scandals that's shaping so much of the response to his Catholicism right now. Obviously, Catholics and progressive Catholics especially are yearning for some good news after 3 decades of bad news. At the same time, the leaders of the church, the bishops, are sorely lacking in moral authority because of 3 decades of complicity and really criminal behavior, the sexual use of minors by Catholic priests. With their credibility low, the chance for a different kind of Catholic figure, one who has a kinship to Pope Francis in attitude and a lot of his positions, I mean Joe Biden, is moving into the breach and suggesting that there is still some moral authority left in this tradition.
Paul Eli, thanks so much.
Thank you, David.
You can read Paul Eli on Biden's faith, the Catholic Church, and much more at NewYorker.com. Paul's a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. This is the New Yorker Radio Hour. Stick around.
The New Yorker Radio Hour is supported by Indeed, committed to helping businesses hire quality candidates. Indeed's Instant Match searches through millions of resumes to deliver candidates who fit the job description. More at Indeed.com/credit. And by Progressive Insurance, offering Snapshot, a device designed to reward safe drivers. Learn more at Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Now that's Progressive.